talk to these men who were coming for food, and no one seemed to think it was unusual. You know, there was a standard thing. My mother would always, they didn't come through the front door. I was to ask them to go to the back door, and then she would have them in the kitchen and cook a meal for them, and they would sit and eat in the kitchen. But that was a very vivid memory. Another memory I have of the Depression was a friend's father was taking her and me to something in New York, and we went across the bridge into Manhattan and went up the Bowery, and that's when I saw the bread lines and I saw the men. It was always men in those days. The women were I never saw on the streets. They never came to the door. It was I suppose they were somewhere or other. And I remember men standing on street corners selling apples in order to get some money to buy food. It was very, very... Oh, and my father, who was a minister, people in the church were having a hard time too, so we didn't necessarily have a steady income of our own. Especially this is a real reflection of the impact of the Depression. Was that Easter Sunday was the Sunday that when the church might make up my father's salary, which hadn't been paid probably for 2 or 3 months or something. So or maybe more. I've never knew the full details. I know that it was very important in our family that Easter be a beautiful, clear day, because otherwise there wouldn't be a big congregation in church, and Papa's salary wouldn't be paid. And that affected me for years afterwards. Whatever kind of day it was on Easter was terribly important psychologically to me. It had no relationship to my well-being, shall we say. And one other thing, when I went to high school, the schools were jammed with students because there were no jobs. And so schools were running on 2 and 3 sessions and very crowded. And as a result of that, my father sent my sister and me to a private school in Brooklyn for high school, because it was just not an educational system had gone downhill because of that.
Mm-hmm. And so would you like to talk more about your experience at the school?
Oh, sure. I should say also, I'm not sure whether this was the Depression or, it probably wasn't Depression, but I had one very vivid memory as a child. And at that point I must have been 6 or 7 years old, I guess. Maybe, no, earlier, because I wasn't in school. I went with my mother, who was going to a fair that's run for, I remember it's for the benefit of the blind. It used to be done every year by the churches in Brooklyn. And we were walking down a street in Brooklyn, where there were these homes with front steps, going up to the main floor. The old brownstone type houses were now occupied by immigrants, probably, or certainly not very well off people. And I made some remark. I had no idea what it was, but I remember my mother stopping me on the street with all these people sitting there on their steps and stuff, giving me a lecture about how everyone in this world is is equal, and I should never think I was better than someone else. And, and it made a huge impression on me. When I went to the high school, it was called Berkeley Institute. It's a school for girls, and it was a school my mother had gone to. When I was going, I went shopping with my mother ahead of time to get something to wear to school, and I remember that it was the only, I knew that it was the only thing I would get. I'd just get one dress for school. And I picked out this dress, and it just didn't fit. In terms of the social package, I felt terribly just out of things, because I had not, I just had this one dress, and it was sort of it wasn't what the girls were wearing at that school. But the school itself was a wonderful school. The largest class I was in high school consisted of 14 students. And they had excellent teachers. One of them taught, or had English and Latin and history and so forth. And I just got to, you can imagine, with a ratio like that in your class, the level of education you got was just tremendous. When I got to college, I was a little bored because it was not as good. And it was a great school. But I also did, we had the advantage of being in New York, too, is that there are all sorts of other things that are mixed into your education. The history teacher, anytime we wanted to go to monthly meetings of the Council on Foreign Relations, I remember they had a luncheon meeting of some sort, a hotel in New York, and students were allowed to sit in the balcony to hear the presentations and so forth, and we went to that every month. And my mother was an artist herself, and we went to all the museums, and she would, you just had this wealth at your fingertips, not expensive things. Once in a while, during the Depression, she got some money we would go to the theater or something, but she always made sure that it was spent for things like that.
Did you appreciate at that time the quality of your education as opposed to attending the public school?
No.
It was just accepted.
Yeah.
Okay, and before we go on, I would like to ask you, why was it so important that it be a nice day on Easter Sunday? You mentioned that there would be less people. Why did less people come when the weather wasn't as good?
Or snowing, as it could happen. It just was Easter Sunday. If you've never been in a minister's family, you probably don't know, but it's the largest. People go to church on Easter who never go on any other day of the year. And it's always people who haven't been there, and the amount of the collection was a very important item.
Mm-hmm. Did most people walk to church services then?
Oh, I would guess so. In Brooklyn, who knows? In Brooklyn, there are churches all over the place, but and there was certainly lots of ground transportation. People didn't drive so much. When I was a child, you could play on the street because there weren't cars on the streets. There weren't cars parked on the streets to take the space away. I mean, they were just wide streets.
Mm-hmm. And when you were younger, what did you like to do in your spare time? Well,
I like to I was something of a tomboy. I loved to play baseball on the street. When I was in high school, I was playing hockey and things like that, basketball, more organized things. My mother was a great opera fan, and one of my childhood memories, which still is with me, was that when they began to broadcast the opera, in those days a radio was a luxury to have in your home, and I can remember we had this sort of large radio in the dining room, and there was a chair there in front of it where Mother would sit Saturday afternoon to listen to the opera. And it was the one day when we were under orders. It was her day. You didn't make noise in that room. If you wanted to do something, you went somewhere else. But on the other hand, she would sit and listening to the opera, and if you wanted to listen, you could sit with her. I remember my sister and I did it all the time. I think probably my brother did. I can't remember. You'd sit there, and she was this great storyteller, and as the music was going on, she was telling the story of what was happening, describing the scene, or the garret in La Boheme or whatever, and what people were saying, and it was just almost like simultaneous translation. I mean, now you have titles when you go to the opera. We had Mother, and we would sit listening to the opera and learning it that way. And I still go to the opera. And we couldn't afford it in those days, needless to say. Certainly with a large family, but she. There was a man named Sal Maggie who had an opera company, and they would do opera in the Hippodrome in New York, and the seats were 25 cents each. So she would, when she thought we knew an opera, she would take us to the Hippodrome so that we could hear it, you see. One of the rules was that we had to read the libretto ahead of time, which we always did dutifully, so we would know what was being said and what was going on. And then you'd go see a live performance, and if she thought we'd seen it enough and really appreciated it, then she would, on those rare occasions when we got some money, she would buy tickets to the Metropolitan. She would take us to the Metropolitan. It was this gradual education. But and it wasn't just opera. We certainly had a lot of music in the family. In summers, we always came up here to Twin Lakes. The family has a place, and during the summers, I would spend most of my time on the lake, sailing or playing tennis or doing things like that. And reading.
And reading, and that leads to my next question. Can you give me some examples of books that you enjoyed reading when you were younger?
Winnie the Pooh and all of those. I'm trying to remember. I certainly read all of the children's classics. I became at some point, I think by this time I was in high school, but I began reading Dickens, I can remember, and someone in my father's church were moving into an old people's home, as they were then known, and they were cleaning out their house, and so they gave me their set of Dickens. Those were that was the first formal set of books I ever had. I did have all of the Winnie the Pooh books, but Dickens was important. But you name any of them. And we were brought up on Shakespeare too, so we certainly read Shakespeare. But the childhood books I don't remember names of so much.
Right.
I do know that I hated Little Women, which was considered I shocked someone recently by telling them that it just seemed to be one of the dullest books in the world. George Eliot, you know the British authors. I read a lot of books. Yeah.
And you've mentioned in the past that your father felt very strongly about providing an education to his daughters, as well as his son. How important was your father's encouragement in pursuing your education in the late 1930s, when educating women was not as customary as it is today?
Well, I don't, it was important, but I have no idea. I certainly didn't think it was important then. Both my parents were very much, mother was certainly always there. And when I was in high school, my father had a study in the house, and there was a big table there. And so that was the table on which I always, where I always did my study. And he was there, and he was, he graduated from Yale in 1902. When he went to Yale, he had to have, as a prerequisite to enter, he told us, he had to know Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And so when I was studying Latin, he would always help me, and I needed it. But he was certainly encouraging, but there was an emphasis on doing your studies and getting your homework done. It was always there, and both parents were there to help, to put it mildly, and encourage.
And who were some of your other role models while you were growing up?
Oh my. In high school, actually I can start in grade school, there was a Mrs. Siegel who was wonderful. High school, there was Miss Catherine was the history teacher, and she certainly had a huge impact on me. And in college, there were several teachers who we talk about, but I was also thinking back that the general atmosphere of the family, and it was primarily my father's family that I knew well. My mother's family, her father lived on Nantucket. By the time that I was growing up, he had moved up there with his second wife. And so you just didn't, and mother's sisters had both died, so that we didn't have that same sense of, whereas the Roraback family was here, and we were with them every summer. My grandfather had been a lawyer. I have no memory of him. He died when I was about 3 or 4. But my grandmother was here, and my father had 2 sisters. One was named Catherine, and she had stayed at home to take care of my grandmother. My other aunt, Grace, had been a school teacher, and she lived in Torrington and then elsewhere, and had some daughters who were very close to us. My uncle, my father's brother, was the lawyer who had taken over this family office. Actually, when my grandfather was still alive, he'd become a judge, but my uncle couldn't carry on the practice here. And so this office was sort of part of living here. You spent half your time walking in to talk to Uncle Clint, you see. And it was part of my life from a very early age. So they're all influences, and certainly the impact of the law office and my uncle were tremendous too, in terms of what I became, I think.
Was it more implied encouragement, or did they believe that you should be an attorney?
Oh, no. No. When I grew up, I had the luxury of believing I could be anything I wanted to be. And both Berkeley Institute and certainly Mount Holyoke College encouraged that in a way that Ella Grasso, who was the year ahead of me at Mount Holyoke, used to talk about how the great thing about going to Holyoke was that you had this sense that and people were telling you in essence that you could be whatever you wanted to be, and it was all out there to pick from. It wasn't something that was imposed on.
And going towards your college years, where did you attend college?
Mount Holyoke, up in Massachusetts.
And what degree did you earn?
Well, I got a Bachelor of Arts, I guess it was. I don't even remember. I think it's a Bachelor of Arts. Haven't looked at it in a long time.
And what was your major?
I majored in economics. Partly, actually, I loved chemistry. I also loved math, but when I was in high school, I just adored doing math. But when I was in college, I got into chemistry, and the only reason I didn't major in chemistry, I think, was that you always had to spend the afternoons in the lab, and I preferred to do my studying at night and enjoying the world around me during the day. So I didn't feel very warmly of living in the lab most of my life.
So what did you do during those afternoon hours at Mount Holyoke?
Oh, might have been almost anything. I certainly played a lot of bridge, which wasn't an outdoor activity. I did that. But there were things, there were lots of outdoor sports, and Holyoke has this lovely campus with lots of space to do things outdoors.
Okay, and who were some of the influential people during your college years, and why?
Okay, there's Amy Hughes, but I'll take her up later because she was the major one. But there was a woman named, well, when I went to Mount Holyoke, I think you have to understand that Holyoke, I entered in the fall of 1937, and that was the year that Roswell Ham became president. He was the first man to be president of Holyoke, and he succeeded a very strong woman named Mary Emma Woolley. I think it was Mary Woolley. Anyway, Miss Woolley had been the president for some time, but and the faculty at Holyoke had for the most part been very, very strong feminists. I mean, I'm talking, they were of a generation that probably they were sort of toward the end of their tenure as professors, so they were in their late 50s. I think they'd really started being feminists back at the turn of the century and into, the whole feminist movement one of the things that I find sad is that younger women don't understand what a rich history continued of feminism went along. Obviously, everybody knows about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, but somehow it all focused on it became focused on the suffrage movement. It wasn't all focused on it, but it became focused on it. And when the vote was achieved, there were a lot of women, I suspect, at least certainly the knowledge of people that I had known, just had no idea of what a rich group of feminists were still there doing various things. I mean, they were fighting fights like the minimum wage and child labor laws and doing other things, but of a social nature. But people sort of forget them, I think. When I went to college, this was the group that was on the faculty. I mean, they were all very, very strong feminists. There was a woman, Deborah Ellis, who taught political science. And she was a very strong teacher, I mean, but also a very rigid person. And she always felt that I won't say, I'm interpreting what she felt, I can't prove it, but she would be terribly disappointed that some of her favorite, a favorite student would graduate and get married and somehow not achieve the full development of her career that Miss Ellis felt she should, because she had this sense that you should be there just using all your faculties all the time and not modifying them for social reasons. And so, you could see this sense of, almost a sense of betrayal. Some rather well-known women whom I remember one, I can't remember her name now, but I could dig it out, who had been her favorite student, married. I guess they were sociologists, I'm not sure, but in any event, they wrote some books together, but she was not out there doing other things which Miss Ellis thought she should be by that time, you see. And this woman was always slightly in the shadow of her husband. And that was the sort of atmosphere you had at Holyoke. I remember, and Amy Hughes was this teacher in the economics department who taught labor economics and really had this huge impact on Ella Grasso as well as on me. But Amy Hughes would start off the school year with all enthusiasm. She would just be there and she would get all excited with students and so forth. But by the end of the semester, not the semester, by the end of the year, she would have been just sort of flattened out because her enthusiasm was gradually disappointed by the students who didn't necessarily think that this was the greatest thing in the world and weren't responding intellectually, especially in those beautiful springs on Holyoke campus. Anyway, Amy Hughes taught labor law, labor economics. And when I was there at Holyoke, she had helped organize something called the Student Industrial Club, which was a group for students and women workers in industry to meet together and learn about what being a woman worker in industry was about. And it was back in the days when the textile industry was big in Massachusetts. I can remember going to several textile factories and garment factories, where these people we'd gotten to know in the club were workers, and seeing what working conditions were actually like, and what the whole system of factory labor was, what it did to you. And that's almost past history in this country now, but except in the sweatshops in New York. But it was a terribly important impact on it. Certainly, and this was at the, while the Depression was still going on. I mean, the Depression didn't end until after World War I. World War II got going. And so I became interested in the labor movement through that. Ella Grasso, who in those days was Ella Tambusi, was her maiden name. Ella was a year ahead of me, and she became the president of the Student Industrial Club, as she was probably in the senior year, I can't remember. And the year after I became head, you see, it was that type of thing. The other thing that Amy Hughes had been involved in, there was something called the Hudson Shore Labor School. And it was a summer school for women workers in industry. It formed by well, it wasn't done by the colleges, but there were representatives, women teaching there, the professors, one from each of these 7 sister colleges, and that from each college they would select one student a year to be a student assistant. So this was, by that time it had a long history, but I won't go into it, but it was situated in an old estate on the Hudson River. That's why it's called Hudson Shore. And a group of women, primarily garment worker union people, I think there may have been some textile workers, would come to the school and spend this time, and we would, one of my jobs was to help to run the co-op, so that they would learn how to have a cooperative and develop that sort of interest. We had, they had writing workshops. They had an English teacher who was teaching them how to do short pieces and write so that they could put out a union paper. Say the point of it all was to train these women to be leaders in unions. And we lived. There were sort of bunk rooms. I remember. I guess there were 4 or 5 of us in one room, and I certainly learned a lot from being with women workers that I didn't learn at Berkeley Institute, I can tell you. But it was just an amazing summer. This stimulation of knowing them. And Ella Grasso went the end of her junior year. I went the end of my junior year, you see, the year following, as a student assistant. And Amy Hughes taught the history of unions and labor stuff in a class there. And there were all these other people there. It was a wonderful, wonderful summer. It had huge impact on me. And Amy Hughes certainly had one. She was very, what's the word I want? She sort of bounced up and down with her energy, enthusiasm and stuff. And she would teach us, she would play labor songs for us and teach us about that sort of thing. Actually, one of the stories I now tell. Ella was very upset with me when it first came out, because it was when she was still governor, and I hadn't publicized it. But after she graduated from Holyoke, she spent another year at Holyoke as an assistant in getting her MA, as an assistant in the economics department. So one of her jobs that year was to teach the statistics lab, and she would teach us while we were supposedly studying statistics. You know, you were learning it. I certainly did well with it. But she also taught us all of the radical songs of the 30s. And did I ever tell you this story? She taught me, and all of the rest of us, but she taught me the words and music. So I can still sing the Internationale, and there were a bunch of others. And Ella, needless to say, when she was governor of Connecticut, was not terribly happy when it was a great joke among my crowd of friends that I'd learned the Internationale from Ella Grassa. And one of them told a reporter or something. I don't know who it was, but I suspect I know who it was, but I never did ask her point blank. One of my friends must have told this reporter, because it was there, printed in Connecticut magazine, that Ella had taught me to read. and she was upset, to put it mildly. Anyway, it was the sort of thing that I was doing during the 30s. Part of that, when you start talking about influences, I think you go back to my parents and the family generally, not just my parents, but mostly my father and mother, that something like unemployment was bad, and people, you should help your fellow man. I mean, there was a very ethical emphasis, social emphasis in my upbringing. That was your role in life. You didn't just go out to make money in the world. You went out to help people, to make the world a little better. I don't know whether it was ever verbalized that way, but in essence, that's what the family was instilling in all of us. And so, you know, in the 30s, I was involved in all sorts of things, involved in the New Deal. I mean, this is late 30s when I'm in college. The New Deal and the labor movement, and so forth. I mean, it was all part and parcel of that background, I think.
And how did you choose economics as a major?
Well, I think I just wanted to know how the world, how I think that it is probably the key thing in the way the world runs. So, unfortunately, it has its bad aspects as well as its good. You have to understand it.
Okay. And you mentioned the president, Ted. There was a new president who was male. How did that, or do you feel it had any effect
not on
the
me.
college?
It had an effect on the college. I mean, you can imagine this group of very dynamic feminists. Getting a man for president was not exactly their idea of how Holyoke should be. And I was very conscious. I mean, I certainly didn't take any positions one way or the other. I mean, a president's a president. I don't think any college student pays much attention, except if the president tries to keep them quiet or something. But the women on the faculty were up in arms about it. I mean, people like Amy Hughes and Ellis and they were all over. There were Miss Adams in zoology, and there was Emma Carr who taught chemistry. And, there were all these very. The first time that they had to respond to a man instead of a woman, and they resented it no end. Now, it wasn't universal on the faculty, but certainly we were conscious of it. And because they made it perfectly clear what they thought. I always thought he must have had a tough time, but anyway.
Okay. And so let's go on to your work experience. You left Mount Holyoke and chose...
Oh, one other thing. I mean, we're really going afield now, and I may take too much time for you. When I was at Hudson Shore, one of my jobs was driving this old station wagon. And the Hudson Shore was located on the west shore of the Hudson River, almost directly opposite was the Roosevelt estate, Franklin Roosevelt's estate, whatever the name of it was, I can't remember now. Mrs. Roosevelt's Valkill was there in that area, just north of Poughkeepsie. And so once a year, Mrs. Roosevelt would have the students from the Hudson Shore come over to Valkill for the day. And I've never forgotten this event. The day before we went, here were all these women who were there at this place for their summer. And so they had all written home when they found out they were going to Mrs. Roosevelt's. And clothes were sent to them so they would have something to wear because they were going to visit, because she was the wife of the president back in 1940. And the week before everybody was doing their hair, they'd get permits to each other. And they were all set to. They were going to see the wife of the president. Well, I drove this one group over. And there were several vehicles, needless to say, for all the people at school. I drove the station wagon, and I always remember pulling up to what I remember as a hedgerow with a gate, and I had been told that that's where we'd get out. And these young women got out, and I was going to have to park the station wagon somewhere else. And the gate opened, and Mrs. Roosevelt walked out in a tank bathing suit and greeted them. And then they're getting out of they're meeting the president's wife, getting out of the station wagon. And she looked and she said, as they started walking in, she said, "But where are your bathing suits?" And they said they didn't have any. She said, "Oh, never mind, we'll find some around here." And in they went. And I went and put the station wagon away. And by the time I got back, I walked in, and here was this group sitting around next to a pool with Mrs. Roosevelt, all in old bathing suits, their hair sort of tumbling down, and this wonderful, warm conversation going on. She made them at home in a way that I just could not believe. It was an absolutely beautiful thing. And actually, it was the morning after. None of us knew this until later. She had been in Chicago to accept the nomination for her husband. It was not the day after, when we were there, the day after he'd been nominated. She'd been there to make the acceptance speech for him and flown back during the night so that she hadn't had any sleep and was sitting there being, she was really just an amazing person. Anyway, it's one of my better memories. And that fall at Holyoke, a friend of mine and I organized a torchlight parade for Roosevelt president. We weren't able to vote yet, but I wasn't 21. But it was quite an occasion. It also had a picture in on the front page of the Hartford Current, which did upset my family. I don't, not my father or mother, but they were all, as you may or may not know, the Rorabacks were great Republicans. So. Have you heard that much?
And that was a wonderful story of Eleanor Roosevelt. And let's talk about your work experience after graduating from Mount Holyoke.
Well, when I first graduated, this is June of 1941, I came up here for the summer, and the family gave me a trip to the West Coast. My sister, by this time, was living out in Los Angeles. Gave me a trip to the West Coast as a graduation present. So I was going out in September, and I went in September, October. When I came back, I began to look for a job, and there were no jobs. Well, I would say no jobs, practically no jobs. The Depression wasn't over in many ways. And also, I had learned how to type, but I didn't admit it to anyone, thank heavens. As it turned out, it was the best thing I never admitted, because well, I wasn't terribly good typist anyway, but the jobs that you could get, women, were office jobs, and they weren't there. I did some volunteer work that fall for an organization called the Women's Trade Union League. It was actually run by a woman I'd gotten to know when I worked at Hudson Shore. And this was an organization in New York that favored trade unions, and it also had worked on things like child labor laws, and it was formed by people like Eleanor Roosevelt and her group who were interested in issues like that. Anyway, I worked there in the office for a couple of months, and then I got a job in an unemployment compensation office in Brooklyn. And that's the first paying job I had in my life. Oh no, that's not quite true. I had a job at Mount Holyoke, for which I got 30 cents an hour. But that was the NYA, as it was known, National Youth Administration. One of the New Deal agencies set this up so that actually students could make their spending money working in various places on campuses. I had the unenviable job of working in a chemistry lab to start with. I finally ended up in the library. Chem lab was hard work. Anyway, my first paying job was at this unemployment compensation division. I was on the line where people would first file their claims, and then I think they had to actually come and pick up their check instead of report that they hadn't gotten the jobs. Anyway, it was that type of a job. And I was there for about a month or so. And at some point I had taken a civil service exam. And I got an offer of a job in Washington to work for the Department of Agriculture in what was known as the Program Surveys Division. And this was an organization that did public opinion surveys for various, actually it was started as part of the Agriculture Department, their Economic Bureau, but it was a very sophisticated and very good public opinion group, and they did jobs for agencies all over Washington, or government agencies, and we do things for the Department of, not only the Department of Agriculture, but for the Treasury Department and for the War Department, and, you know, depending on who. We did one survey, I remember, on savings bonds. That's when the whole business of selling war bonds and savings bonds really began, was during that period. One of the surveys related to that. And it was very in-depth interviews and quite amazingly accurate stuff. I mean, very sophisticated sampling procedures were used. We did a survey of Detroit when I was there, and I went out to Detroit for that. We were there for about a month or so, and the survey consisted of 300 interviews, and these rather in-depth interviews. And in the report on that survey, we predicted that there would be a major race riot in Detroit, and it occurred about 6 months later. It was just an amazing survey. Anyway, later on, it was after that riot, but at some point I knew people in what was known as the War Labor Board, which was an agency to settle strikes and prevent strikes by settling issues. And I decided I wanted to work for the War Labor Board. I mean, a friend who worked there was in personnel or something. Anyway, there was an opening in Detroit, so I went to Detroit, and I lived in Detroit for maybe a year and a half, working for the War Labor Board. And that itself was very interesting, because Detroit was so polarized between labor and industry. I mean, there's nothing comparable to it that I've ever seen. You were either for or against labor. But if you were working for the government, supposedly in between the two, it was an island. And actually, the people you knew socially, for the most part, were just the people who were also working for the government, because nobody else would talk to you. It was a very strange sort of position to be in. Anyway, it was a very interesting experience. And I was presenting I was doing analysis of cases and presenting them to the board and so forth. And at some point, I left Detroit and went back to the national board, which was in Washington, and I worked on cases there. And at the national board, the reports would be made to a committee, and the committee made the report to the board. But so I was presenting cases to a committee, but then there was one really crucial moment when there was a threatened strike in Hollywood, actually, and I had worked on the analysis of it, and it was going to be, I had to report it directly to the Labor Board, so I walked into this august body, which included all the big names. I remember John Lewis sitting there, for instance, one time. Anyway, there I was. And my boss, who was a very delightful woman, and I was petrified, I can tell you. I could just see myself freezing and not being able to speak. And she said to me, "Oh, don't let them get you. Just spit in their eye." I never did it, but the thought as I sat there, I wonder if I really could spit that far, was the thing that sort of saw me through. And I survived it. I was working there. I had moved up to the head of the division. I was doing that stuff. By that time that I left, the war ended, and I decided that's when I'd go to law school, so I did.
Before I ask you about your law career, I'm curious, was it unusual for a woman to travel away from their home to take a position at that time?
Well, I wasn't away from home. I was away from home when I first went to Washington. No, there wasn't. There were a lot of people who went to Washington. I mean, especially women, because they were desperate. I was unique, actually, in Washington, in the War Labor Board. I had permanent civil service status because I'd been hired by agriculture as a permanent civil service. And I retained that status, even though I'd gone over the War Labor Board. When I was leaving, the head of the board, the director of the whole board, was a man named Willard Woods, who later became the dean of the Chicago Law School. And he was very enthusiastic about my going to law school, but he wanted me to be able to keep my civil service standing, you see. If he could lay me off, because they were laying people off by that time, if he could lay me off, then I could go to law school and come back if I wanted to as a federal government, to the federal government. And unfortunately, he discovered that in order to lay me off, he'd have to lay off the entire staff of the board. Because I had permanent status, and so I would be the one favored. And so I quit. I had a horror of becoming a bureaucrat, so I went off to law school. But I remember that. It was so funny.
And what do you attribute your decision to attend law school?
Oh, it was something, actually, I had thought of it when I got out of college. I was thinking, you can be anything you want to be. I was thinking of either going to law school or going to social work school. And I recently discovered among some papers, I remembered that I had somehow gotten the catalog for NYU Law School, but I found among some papers a letter to my parents when I was in college. I think it's a letter. It's something or other saying that NYU had I think scholarships for women. I'm not sure, but it was, you know, it was the sort of thing. It meant that I could go to NYU, and I was thinking of it at that point. And then I decided I didn't want to go to school anymore for a while. That I wanted to just do other things. And so I was going to take a year, and of course the war came along, and I never did go until after the war was over. But I'd been thinking about it for a long time.
Did your work experience have any effect on how you approach law school?
Well, two ways. Number one, I don't think I would have gotten in Yale if I hadn't had this great work background. My grades in college had been good the first couple of years. Then I during the spring of 1940, I guess it must have been, when the invasion of the lowlands, and actually it began earlier. Sort of, I was really a pacifist when the war began, but there I was in college, you know, and you began to wonder as various things were going on. But when the invasion of the lowlands began, it sort of heated up. I was taking a political science philosophy course with Ellis, and it's the only course I did well in. We stayed up all night, every night. I'm talking 3, 4 in the morning, arguing politics and political philosophy and exploring where we were at. And, you know, it was an exhausting period. And I sort of skimmed through other courses, but I did very well in political philosophy. But my grades were affected by that sort of thing. And when I was going to law school, I really thought that I probably wouldn't make it. Make Yale, because it's, even then, was hard to get into. But I think it was my work experience and my background that did it. There's something else I thought of. How did you frame the question? Why did I pick? No.
How did your work experience have?
The other thing was that I could study so easily. It was the most amazing thing. That it was as though I could sit down and really do it in a way that I had not been able to do when I was in college. I was a much better student in law school.
Okay.
It's what's known as maturity, I guess.
And did you focus on a particular area of law?
No. I would actually, I certainly wasn't focused on anything specifically. I certainly had two things in my mind. Number one was labor law, since I had this background and experience. But the other was just being sort of a general practice sort of thing, which was quite common in those days. It isn't as much now. And it's sort of part of the background of having grown up in the atmosphere of this office, you know.
Excuse me.
so sorry to interrupt you.
It's okay. I'm worried about this one. It's gone for a long time. They'll think it. Okay. Now, where was I?
You're talking about the other influence
Oh, what?
on your work experience.
No, you asked me whether I specialized in anything.
Right. Thank you.
I really, this office was historically just, my uncle was a great trial lawyer, but he also had this general practice, which was quite common with people who practiced in not in New York City, but outside the environs of a large metropolis. And he did a lot of criminal work as well as civil work. So I just had that as a pattern in my head. And certainly I had decided I was going to practice in Connecticut, not New York, because I didn't want to specialize. And I didn't want to go to the big firms, that type of thing. So that I looked for a job in Connecticut. But when I went to law school, that was in my head. And in fact, at the Yale Law School in those days, you didn't really specialize in the way that people do nowadays, I think.
And can you describe your experience while attending law school at Yale?
Well, when I went, which was October of 1945, it was at a time when people were leaving the armed forces, and so there were a lot of students who had been at law school, had been in the Army or Navy, and were coming out of that and coming back to law school. It was my generation, and I had taken 4 years working, they'd taken 4 years fighting, and we were all, it was roughly the same age group. There were also a number of women and a few, well, I don't know the other students because I didn't know them that well, I guess, but there were, when I went to law school, there were a total of 30 women out of 450 students. Total of 450 students. The usual question I'm asked for, you were the only woman in your class. That's totally irrelevant, because I was there with all this group that's coming back, some of whom had been there, some hadn't, and I was the only woman that entered that fall, but there were 30 of us, and we were really what's the word? Anyway, we were a group. They had just a lounge for women, because the women didn't live at the law school. The men lived at the law school. The women had they put us, most of us, in a fraternity house a couple of blocks away that had been condemned as a fire hazard, so they had a bunch of women students there. We were in either that or in another similar house, so that you had this coherent group of women all stretched throughout all of the 6 terms of law school. They were running 3 terms a year, so that people were spread throughout the period. And entering at that point, number one, I hadn't lived in a dormitory-like environment for a long time. And it is a major readjustment in one's life. Luckily, at least people were a little older, so I guess we all had the same problem. But it was something new. I also, it was communal eating. It was just a different life physically. And studying was fascinating. I just had a wonderful time doing the studying, but taking an exam was a major adjustment. I can remember the first time I had to take an exam. I was so tense, not knowing what to do. I remember it every time I hear it now. I'm a great chamber music fiend, and I played the Brahms clarinet quintet before I went and took the exam. And since I passed the exam, I guess it was good, but I had to do something. But other than that, I could graduate. It was harder to take an exam than anything. It was easy to study, but hard to take exams.
And how did your male peers and professors in the law program relate to you?
Well, it was this group of us that was there that, for the most part, my memory is it was the male students and not the professors who were most chauvinistic. I mean, there were things that went on. There was an eating club at the Yale Law School called Corby Court. That was only open to men. And I think that there were some men who thought of the women in the law school as proper sexual companions, shall we say, and not as equals in terms of performance. I had an interesting realization, and whether this was male stuff or whether it's just my own background. Most people in law school talk a mile a minute, very, very learnedly. And I think it took me a couple of years to realize that certain of the people who seemed to always have an answer and put down anyone who didn't have the temerity to create one, when I began to realize that they weren't really saying anything as they talked. And they said it with great authority. I didn't say. So once I realized that, I began to feel better about what's going on. But there was a professor that, this is on this Bar Foundation tape. There's a professor who ran he taught tax law, supposedly one of the great liberals of the faculty. And he never called on a woman except for one day a year, which he referred to as Ladies' Day. At which point he would call on them and berate. No, it's not funny. It was one of the most vicious performances that you could imagine, trying to tear into them and making snide remarks. At least this was all reported to me. I never found out, because when I took the course and when he began to call on women one day, I left. And I couldn't persuade anybody else to leave with me, but I just took off, and so I never sat to actually hear it go on. But it was a lousy thing that he did. I understand that there have been others in this world who do the same thing. He was the only one in the faculty at that time at Yale who did. There were also professors who, well, not professors. there were certain professors who tended to listen to men more than they'd listen to women. I think that was part of it. Women probably weren't talking quite the right lingo for them or something. There was a course in admiralty law, and I don't know if you know anything about the sea, but there, at one point in history, right up through World War II, it was considered bad luck to have a woman on a ship. Do you know that?
No, I didn't.
I'm not sure that it's totally true, because certainly you had these fancy liners with lots of women on them, but you know, a working ship was. And admiralty law, when they were giving a course in it, and I'm a great sailor. I was a great sailor, and so I just thought it'd be fun to take admiralty. I took admiralty, and it was a shock because no woman had ever taken admiralty at law school. And you know, I learned one thing, that there's a difference between a ship and a boat. And if you referred to a boat, you could be laughed out of class unless you used it in the proper sense. Anyway, that type of thing sort of hung on in various ways. You know, we had a group of wonderful friends, and I mean, there's a crowd of us, group of the women and of the men who were together all the time, and it was all fine, but it was, the general atmosphere was still slightly chauvinist.
Okay. The Socratic method of teaching, the question and answer, is commonly used.
You better turn this. I don't know what the Socratic method is. I don't remember anymore. So. You'll have to explain it to me.
Well, it was where they question back and forth between professor and student.
Oh, no, so, who knows? When you talk to lawyers, you'll find out that there's the Facebook method. Do you take the facts of not the facts of the case. It began in Harvard back at the turn of the century. I guess they began teaching from cases, and you take a case and analyze the facts and then see how it fit with the law, etc., and argue back and forth about, this may be Socratic for all I know. I can remember contracts class. The professor would start off every class with reciting a series of facts. A does so-and-so, B does... Is it a contract? He'd ask. And he'd point his finger at some student. And unfortunately, the course was given at 8:15 in the morning, which was not my better time. And one morning he did this to me, and I said yes. And then he goes off to someone else, and then he comes, recites some more facts, and he points his finger and says, "Is it a contract?" And I said no. And he said, "But before you said blah, 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 it was a contract." And I said, "I changed my mind." And I never got called on again in that class. I think he understood that I was really struggling. But in any event, that's the way law school would go.
Did you have mentors in law school?
I don't know. The word mentor, there was certainly no formal mentorship. And to begin with, I don't know whether we talked about it earlier, but there are no women on the faculty. So there were no women in positions of any authority in the law school except for one who was the secretary to the dean. And she, by the force of her personality, ran a lot, but she certainly didn't dominate how the law was taught or anything. There were some great professors, and certainly the whole faculty was pretty spectacular. And I had some good friends, but I had a lot of friends on the faculty.
Mm-hmm. Did any of them influence or shape the career that you made?
No. By the time I was in law school, I mean, I was taking courses, and certainly some of the things I did were helped by knowing them and having taken some of their courses, knowing them afterwards, because I maintained a lot of friendships on the faculty. They didn't shape my career so much as abetted it. Yeah. Tom Emerson, who was probably the foremost First Amendment scholar in the country, was a very close friend, and Fowler Harper taught torts and family law, and was a very good friend. There were others, but I suppose Tom and Fowler were closer than the others.
Mm-hmm. Which leads us to your law career, which spanned well over 50 years and was quite spectacular. And can you tell me about your first case?
I'm not sure which my first case was. I have no idea.
I should rephrase the question.
Okay.
Meaning, what was one of your early cases that was special to you?
Oh, well, it sort of stood out. What I was doing, I should say, before that, I went to, actually, from a woman's perspective, when I think in the Hall of Fame, it probably is important here. Getting a job was in itself something. I suppose that's when I was looking. It was when I realized for the first time just what a male-oriented profession it was, and I must have known it in law school too, but certainly it was brought home vividly. I knew when I was looking, for instance, I'd learned it too when I was looking. I'll start off first by saying that my uncle said to me when I was graduating from law school, or when I passed the bar, I had a job. That's right. Reminding me of things I'd forgotten about. When I got out of law school, it was in February of '48, and there was a law firm in Stamford, left-wing law firm, which did labor law, and I had a job there while I was studying for the bar, living in Maine. I used to commute to Stamford, and I worked on these labor cases there. Now that, when I say left wing, that goes back to, by this time you're in post-war U.S. and what later became known as McCarthyism had already well before the McCarthy appeared on the scene, and so that there were left-wing firms and there were right-wing firms in the labor movement, I mean, labor law stuff. Now, probably a right-wing labor law would be considered radical to do it, but then it was left-wing labor. I mean, anyway, Sam and Milt's office was definitely left-wing, represented the United Electrical Workers, among others. And I worked on a case, that's interesting, I'd forgotten about it. I worked on a case involving the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers Union. And after I'd gotten out of law school, after I'd passed the bar, in the summer of '48, and was a full-fledged lawyer, I was looking for a job. I did not go to Sam and Milt's office. I guess they didn't have room to have a third lawyer there. I was looking around for various places. My uncle told me that he'd love to have me come up here, but that it would be a big mistake for a single woman to live in single professional woman just live in a small town. He thought that I would have a much better personal life if I stayed out, stayed in a city of some sort. And so I was looking around at various places in the state. I wanted to be in Connecticut. That's what I'd always planned on doing. Because I didn't want to have to go specialize in New York. One of those huge New York firms. I went around looking, and then I really discovered this thing. Number one, there'd been a friend of mine named Mary Fitzgerald at law school. She had graduated before me, and she had gone to work with this law firm in Hartford. I knew her partner who had hired her. I went up to talk with him, and he just said that, you could have one woman in the firm, but you really couldn't afford to have more than one woman. And I looked around here and there. There was a public defender, wonderful man in New Haven, who was an old friend of my uncle's, Tom Robinson, and I went to see him. I went to see a lot of people, mostly friends of the family and stuff, or someone I knew somehow or other. Anyway, I went to see Tom Robinson, and Tom had just hired two young men as associates, and he just didn't have the work to take on someone else, but we talked about things. At the time I was supposed to go to Wigan and Dana, which is a big firm, and it's bigger now. When big firms in those days were 5 or 6 people, nowadays it's 100 or so. Anyway, Wigan and Dana might have even had, no, I think they had 10, but at least 5 or 6. And I said I was on my way over to see Wigan and Dana, and Tom Robinson told me that I should go, but I should not take a job there. And I said, why? And he said, well, do you know Catherine Tilson? And Catherine was a woman who was maybe 10 or 15 years older than I, who had gone to work for Wigan and Dana. Her husband worked there too. But he said, you don't want to be like Catherine Tilson. You don't want to be Fritz Wigan's bag carrier. And I said, well, it's true. But if you went into a firm, you were pegged. There was a firm in New Haven in those days, Gumbar, Corbin, Tyler, and Cooper, there was a woman there who was easily 30 years older than I. Maybe, I guess 30 would be just about 25 to 30. years older than I was. And her name was Mary Manchester. She was the authority on probate law in the state of Connecticut. Everyone turned to her. She had written the latest edition of the book on probate law in Connecticut, and she was at Gumbard Corbin. She was not a partner. She was made a partner later, but she never became a named partner of that firm, even though she was the person who probably gave them all their probate work, because she was such a probate authority. And, you know, and there were these other firms. I went to a firm in Bridgeport, the first named partner of which had been my father's roommate in college. And when I just stopped in there because I was in Bridgeport for something else to ask if I could make an appointment. And this woman who was the office manager, white-haired herself, told me that my father's friend was in Europe, and but that when he came back, she knew he would want to talk with me, see his roommate's daughter, etc. You know. And so she said, but don't take a job here. And I said, why not? And this was right in the office. You know, we were in a private office that she had. She said, you'll never see a client. She said, you'll be sitting in a room. You know, if they give you a job, you'll be sitting in a room just doing research for other lawyers. And she said, just don't come. Anyway, I was fortunate. I got a job with a single practitioner who was a bankruptcy specialist, a friend of Fowler Harper's, actually. That's how I got to know him. And Harry had this very active bankruptcy practice, but he also had, you know, as lawyers did in those days, all these other little things that someone who was being addicted, you know, a speeding case in court, you name it, all these various petty things, some estates that he needed to take care of and everything. It was a typical general practice type thing. And so I was able to do anything I wanted to in that office, and what he really wanted me to do was do everything else except what he specialized in. And that's what I did. I had experience such as, you know, I tried cases my first year. Friends of mine who were in law school didn't, some of them never tried a case, but I was in, and there were cases that, you know, if you lost them, you felt badly, but they weren't serious losses. And I can remember going to the city court in Hartford, which in those days was in, I guess it's probably what was City Hall, but not the current City Hall. I remember the courtroom, this very dim room. It looked as though you were in a Dickens courtroom. On the bench, there were these lamps. There was sort of a post type of thing with a bulb on the top that would shed a certain amount of light around. And this room full, and what was going on in those days was that people would be picked up for, I suppose they called it vagrancy, I don't know, but sometimes it was, but were just people didn't have a place to sleep. They were sleeping on the streets and stuff. And they'd get a range, and the prosecutor would call the case, and this person would shuffle up. They'd been brought up from the holding cell they'd been in all night. And the judge would say, you know, after, are you some, they'd have the name identified, and where are you from? And you'd say no, you know, had no certain address. Then the judge would say, where are you going when you leave here? And he said, oh, I'll get out of town or something. It was, I'm not sure just how, are you leaving town? That's probably the phrase I don't know what they used. And they would gather these people, and I'm talking about 15 or 20 people in the morning, put them in a paddy wagon and drive them to the edge of town and release them, and they would start walking down the road. And they'd end up, you might see them the next week in New Haven, see them in Bridgeport. You know, they would just do the rounds of these, and that's the way courts started. But in any event, the cases I tried were in that kind of court. And one of my early cases with Harry was doing an eviction, defending an eviction, because in those days housing was very tight when people came back from the war. And this was one of his better clients who was getting evicted, and so it was tried before a justice of the peace in those days. It didn't have a regular court. And Harry gave me the file and said, take care of it. And I said, what do I do? And he said, you file every motion in the book and do everything you can to delay it. And it was, you know, it's how I learned practice. I went through the book and did this motion. But that was my training.
Good.
And then I will tell you about the first criminal case I really remember, which, and I know there were others before, but it was May 1st, because it was a May Day meeting that the Communist Party were having in the Worcester Square area of New Haven, and it had been broken up by a gang in the area, and the communists were, needless to say, arrested. Nobody else was, for breach of peace and resisting arrest, and you name it. So I was called by someone. I was active in the Progressive Party. Somebody in the Progressive Party who'd known me called me and said these people have been arrested. And he said, gorgeous afternoon, sort of like, it was warmer than today. I mean, it was one of those days when you just, one thing you were doing was outside. So it was a Saturday. I wandered around New Haven that day. I'd gotten my hair done. I was going to go to the theater that night. I stopped in the office and found that there was this call for me, so I called, and they told me that these people had been arrested and could I get them out on bail. And I had no idea what to do. Literally. And I went to, I called up Harry, my boss, and asked him. And in those days, there were 3 judges. And so he said, well, you have to get hold of a judge to get the bond reduced. But, you know, what you should do, Charlie Album, who was someone I knew, one of the lawyers in town, Charlie Album is the clerk of the court. You should just call him and talk to him, because he's the one who has to arrange the entire thing, and he'll tell you how to do it. So I call up Charlie, and he said, he told me that the 3 judges, one of them was Dominic Salato, whose son is still a judge now. Anyway, Dominic Salato was I mean, these were communists, and this was 1949 that this happened. So, Dominic Salato will be out in East Haven scraping his boat, but you don't want to try to get him if you can possibly avoid it. I can't remember who the second judge was. The third one was a man named Al Provis, and he said, well, he'll be playing golf at Woodbridge Country Club, and and so you'll have to call him there. And he said, and you have to talk to him, get him to, he's probably the best one to call. And he said, you have to get the bond reduced, and then have him call me and tell me when the bond's reduced, and then you have to come to my house with whoever's going to post bond for me. And these are big bonds. I mean, they put $5,000 bonds on each of these people, which in 1949 was a lot of money. Still was a good deal, but it was a lot then. So you have to bring someone to the house with a deed. And he said, you should be giving me a certificate of title, but it's all right. If you tell me, Catherine, that this is the man and he has this deed and he owns this property, I'll take that. And your assurance to me that it's clear. So I said, this is what's, you can imagine this happening now. Anyway, and then he tells me all the other things that we don't talk. We finished the phone conversation. I'm on my way to try to get the bond reduced. Charlie said, oh, one more thing. I said, what's that? He said, don't try any of this silly law school stuff like habeas corpus. It takes too long. And I've always said that was my introduction to criminal law.
Were there any cases that meant the most to you?
And this is an interesting question because, I mean, there are a lot, most of my cases meant a lot to me. One of the great things of practicing law is that you're helping people and you're doing things for people, and you know, each one has its own wonderful thing, and sometimes they're more dramatic than others. You have a Black Panther case or something, but every case, and in a way, one of the most meaningful cases I ever did, I've got a million of them actually, but it was a divorce case, because I was representing a woman. I'd known her father quite independently, and she came to me sort of apologetically. Her husband was a lawyer, and she thought it would be embarrassing for me to represent her. I assured her that it would be fine. I certainly could do it. That she needed it, she should have one. But she was this very delightful, she was a nice person, let's put it that way, but she was obviously cowed by her husband. And in those days it was not an unusual thing. She was afraid to talk about a divorce. Although she couldn't stand the situation she was in, and it was as though you didn't do it. They had 3 children, and he had said that well, I'm not sure it even started then, maybe it's later after I'd started. Well, in any event, at some point he said that she couldn't have the son, and she'd have the daughters. But, she was just this very nice person who was caught in an awful situation and with no self-confidence about getting out of it. And I represented her. We went through a divorce that went on for, well, I brought the action. He said she wanted to, her father had friends who ran this very fancy finishing school in Europe and had gotten her a job there so that she could go there, to be away from the whole situation. She wanted to take her son, who at that point was about, he was 10 years old, something, he was young, and he said she couldn't take him, that he'd have her arrested if she took him out of the state. So I started a divorce action, and eventually worked it out so that she took the son to Europe with her, and she worked there for a year. She came back, she lived in New York, and the husband is contesting the divorce like mad. Eventually he sued her for desertion. And in those days you had to prove, contested divorce was very hard to get, unless you had real physical cruelty or, anyway, other extreme grounds. I can't remember the word for it. Not bigamy, but, illegal sexual intercourse. What is it? Adultery. Adultery you could get a divorce on, and you might get custody of the child if you could prove it. But for just impossible situations, they were just real tough cases. You had to have witnesses to support it and so forth. So anyway, she comes back from Europe, gets a job in New York, and had an apartment there, and brought the son up there. Her two daughters had been away at school, I think, when she went to Europe, so they didn't go with her. Maybe that's when they started school. In any event, it ended up with she got divorced. She met and married a very delightful, well-known public man, and she herself became this wonderful, outgoing, sparkling personality. And which was always, I didn't create that, but I gave her the chance to come out to be it. And, that's something that you don't have a chance to do much in this world. And very, very meaningful. And it was very meaningful. She's still a very close friend of mine.
What was it like litigating cases in the courtroom?
You're asking me, like, as a woman, or just?
If it's relevant as a woman, or just as a...
Oh, it became, that's probably one of the important things I did in this world, I would think. Two things. The question sort of doesn't quite approach it the way I'm thinking of it, but let me just... you have to remember that when you try a case, and you're litigating it to accomplish an end, take the average criminal case, for instance. If someone is accused of having assaulted someone else, what led to the assault? What was the background of it? how does it fit into our social expectations in certain situations? What do you try to do? You try to, number one, try to recreate what the scene was when the assault occurred. Now that's creates a lot of in the process it's sometimes very difficult to do, because you're trying to represent a client who probably by the time the case is being tried has been in jail for 6 months or a year, or may or may not have been, but if it's a serious case, may have been in jail for a lengthy period of time. And it's not the same person as the person who was arrested. Also, depending on how good how sophisticated a brain they have, may not be able to recreate or explain. It's not recreating, explain who they were then as compared to now. And so much of it is the context of the way the court looks at things. Back in 1948, until the late 60s, there were no male judges, no female judges. I think Ellen Bree was the first woman to become a trial judge in Connecticut. And my memory is that would have been in the end of the 60s. So you're in a courtroom. I should have. I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but there may have been a woman or two who sat on juvenile cases. I'm not sure when Frederica Brenneman became a judge, and she was originally a juvenile judge. Maybe some of the juvenile judges were women, but that was also pretty late. But when I was first doing this, it was just men. So when you're trying to present this case, you're trying to present your client in the best, who was he at the time that it happened, and what was going on around him, and what was expected of him, etc. What are the mitigating factors in essence? Which goes to the question of what degree of crime it is. And when you're talking about an assault, you may have just a slap on the face. So, which level are you bringing it back to, even though they charged a very high level? And it's all a question of presenting it, sort of like directing a play almost. And how do you get some of that information in? Now, if you only have men sitting on the bench, and you're living in a pretty patriarchal society, and 48, 49 was still pretty patriarchal. The law, the judges and the bench and the law are always about 10 or 15 years behind the times anyway, in terms of when social change is occurring. It filters back in various ways, but you have to factor that in when you're trying the case too. And some judges are different than others. I think being a woman did not affect that process. In a way, I had a real advantage that most other people don't have in this world. My name was Roraback. I came from a family well known in the state, and from a family of lawyers. So not only my father, my uncle and my grandfather, but but we had cousins in Tarrington who were well-known lawyers, you know, and there were Rorabacks around, and Uncle Henry was doing his own thing over in Hartford. So that I didn't, you know, if I'd been Jane Smith, it would have been a much different thing. Going in as Catherine Roraback, half the bar knew my uncle, because it wasn't a big bar in those days, and he was a well-known trial lawyer. So there I was, you know, they were looking at me in a much different light. And so, unfortunately, I don't say unfortunately, I mean naturally, I guess, I didn't really think of it in terms of trying to change the perception of the patriarchal society. When I was working on a case, I was just trying a case, and I learned all these great techniques, and knew how to try a case pretty well when I came along into the late 60s. But in those first days, I was just trying cases, and when you tried it, and there were some really tough issues to deal with at times for women. There weren't many women defendants, but in that first Communist Party thing, the night of those arrests, when I'd gotten everybody out on bail, they had a party, and the New Haven police broke into the party, arrested people on rather prehistoric charges, including a young woman who lived in the house where the party occurred. And they had seized her in the drug cabinet in the bathroom, had been a contraceptive, and they seized it as evidence and charged her with lascivious carriage. Now this was an ancient sort of, I think it went back to the original Connecticut statutes, when there was a charge that any act which, it was criminal to perform any act which arouses lewd or lustful emotions. And, you know, lascivious carriage was used for all sorts of things in those days. But they arrested her for that. I think her worst act was that she'd been dancing with a black man at the party. Maybe they saw it, I'm not sure. Anyway, and they seized this contraceptive, which in those days they could do. The law had changed a good deal by about the 60s. But, she was a graduate student at Yale. And if Yale had learned of this arrest, if she was convicted of it, certainly if she was convicted of it, they would know it, and she wouldn't get her degree. So what you did was not to try to change the attitude of the court. You tried to get her. I didn't represent. I got another lawyer to handle those cases because it was just too much for me to try to do both of them when I was first out. So I don't remember the details of how it worked out. I know she got her degree. I think we just postponed it long enough so that she was convicted after she got it. But that was the sort of thing you were dealing with. And in 54, there was a prosecution of the leaders of the Communist Party in Connecticut, known as the Smith Act case. And I was representing, among others in that case, a woman who was she was on the National Committee of the Communist Party, and she'd been arrested to these conspiracy charges. So they had all sorts of different charges. We don't have to get into the details of it. But in representing her, I began to in preliminary things, it was interesting. She was being held at the New Haven County Jail, and so I went to see her at the jail. Now, in those days, the women at the jail were held in a separate wing. Now they're held in a separate jail, I think. And then they had a separate wing, and it was a huge room, around the side of which were cells. And then in the middle of the room was this large table. It must have been about 12 feet long, I think. It was a big, big table. I think that's where they all ate, sitting in the chairs around it. And they had a matron. So I went in and I had identification. You know, the matron went and got my client, who was let her out of her cell, and she came and sat at the table, and I sat down with her, and the matron sat right down next to her, and I said I wanted to have a private conference, and she said, I sit with any of the inmates when they are conferring, and I said, then I'm a lawyer, and she said, when they confer with a lawyer, I sit here. And so I said to my client, oh, I'm sorry, I'll be back. Now, it's the first time I'd represented a woman who was being held in jail. That's interesting. I'll be back. And I went and saw the judges in federal courts. And she was being held in a state facility, or a county. So I went to see the judge, and I said, and he was sort of shocked. But he immediately issued an order, and the matron never forgave me, and they said she wasn't able to sit and listen in on our conferences. But it was that type of society we were living in. And I suppose that it may be that some of the prostitutes, etc., who were there were, maybe that's why they had the matron sit with them, but she didn't sit with us. But I tried that case, and I don't remember making anything special of the fact that she was a woman in that case. Other than, representing her. Right. The interesting thing in retrospect is I saw one of the, well, I went to someone's funeral, actually, who'd been one of the defendants in that case, and one of the others was there, and we were standing talking to someone, and he referred to the 7 defendants, and I said there were 8. And he did not count this woman as one of the defendants in the case which he was. Interesting, right? You just, oh, her. So it was when I was in the late 60s. I mean, all the cases I tried, and I certainly was trying divorce cases and so forth. And I may have handled a divorce for a woman somewhat differently, but I don't remember, I don't remember doing it. The late 60s, I was at a meeting of the National Lawyers Guild. My memory is it was, I think it was 69, 68 or 69. Which was after the newer women's movement had started to blossom. It was the sort of the new left feminist movement that was engaging with these, maybe you did it, I don't know, consciousness raising. So I never had been involved in any of that. By that time, I'm what, 49, or 48 or 49. But a lot of women were doing this consciousness raising, and there was a meeting, the first at the Lawyers Guild, of which I'd been a member since I'd been admitted to practice. They had the first meeting of what they called the Women's Caucus. And it was what it really was a consciousness-raising session. You know, all of the younger women, and the executive director was a young woman and stuff. They were all there having a consciousness-raising session in the context of the law. See, they were all practicing. They were practicing law. They were law students. I mean, there were certainly, some of them were lawyers by then. There was one older woman from Los Angeles who participated on the formal presentation, you see. And only women were present in that room. They began talking, and it was, to me, one of the most painful days of my life, because I suddenly realized that I had accepted quite easily, not easily, but I certainly, as I had practiced law, I had accepted my role as a woman, and that not as a woman challenging what was going on, but accepting what was going on. You know, when you sit in the judges' chambers and people tell jokes, which always occurs when there are conferences with a judge. Well, it depends on the judge. Some judges were better than others at jokes. And some very good jokes were told, let me tell you. But if they were sexist jokes, you know, you didn't make an issue of it. If a remark was made in court that would ordinarily be insulting nowadays, you wouldn't make an issue of it. You accommodated yourself to it, and in some ways it was all very pleasant and nice, you know. And I never thought of it, but by the time this caucus arose, I suddenly realized what I had become, and I was not challenging this role that I had been put into. Not in a nasty way, but just, you know, you have to raise the consciousness of the court as to what they're doing. And I had never done it. And I had built up all sorts of layers of acceptance of my role that really were very painful to examine. And I left that meeting just sort of, but I sat through the whole thing. Two others, my contemporaries in the guild, left, and a few years later, I was doing the keynote speech for a convention of the guild, and I spoke of this experience and said that it was, to me, it was like pulling scabs off wounds, and it was a painful process of just digging. And what fascinated me was that this one woman who never admitted anything about that meeting that I ever heard, but at some point I heard her make a speech maybe a year or two after that, and she referred to the scab thing. So which really I thought was fascinating. Anyway, this was immediately before, or when I was first involved in, and that's what I'm not sure, the Panther case. And of course, in the Panther case, I represented Erica Huggins, among others. And when we walked in the courtroom, or maybe it must have been after that first scene in the courtroom, the first day when they were arraigned in court, you know, and so forth. And Erica came in, and she, of course, was held out at Niantic, so I hadn't seen her. She was brought in by the sheriffs, and she's standing next to me, and I had spoken to her, and I turned to look at the court, and she just looked up and she said, I heard her say, "Oh my God." And I turned around wondering what was wrong, you know. And she said, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "It's all men." And, you know, and I looked at that courtroom and realized, well, the court reporters were men, the clerks were men, the sheriffs were men, the judge was a man, the prosecutor was a man, you know. Most of the other lawyers were men. And I just looked, and it was as though I thought, I'd totally forgotten it. It was so much part of my life I hadn't even thought of it. And this combination of those two experiences made me begin to do things in a much different way. And I, at the same time, I had been making speeches for the last year or two before that. I went to the Guild meetings a lot. I always made speeches at the Guild meetings urging younger women to get into court. And that it would be important that they should know how to try cases. But I'm not sure when I really had sort of begun to do that in connection with these other time things. I mean, it's all roughly the same time frame. And then there was something called the Women in the Law Conference, which law students began to do, and that was along in that time frame too. And so women who had been practicing law, I guess that probably was, we're into the 70s by that time maybe, we would be on panels and with students who were just learning about things, you know. But I kept having this thing that getting women into the courtroom would make a difference. Now, of course, getting male patriarchal women in is not going to help anything. But if you got sensitized young women into the courtroom, things could change. So I would talk about the need to do that sort of thing too. And I began to develop some stuff in the Panther case that I think carried over into a lot of other stuff. Because someday, just for your own edification, you will be fascinated to read something that's by Elizabeth Glaspell. And Glaspell. She wrote a short story called A Jury of Her Peers. And it's in various collections. I don't know how to find it. I have it. Somebody gave it to me. Actually, I found a source for it too. But anyway, it's in a collection somewhere. But there she talks about. It's not a courtroom scene, but it's a very interesting thing, and really reflects on this as well. But if you're sensitized, you know how to deal with you're dealing with custody cases, for instance. It's a much different representation of the client. If you're a feminist who thinks that the various factors are important in terms of the custody, or if you're doing a criminal case with a woman involved. You know, when we tried the Panther case, Charlie Gary, you know, this is the final trial, was the trial of Erica Huggins and Bobby Seale. And Bobby Seale was represented by a man named Charlie Gary, who was an old-time trial lawyer, very dramatic, and he was the Panther lawyer as well. But he could never understand how I could construct defense for Erica Huggins, because his only concept of how you defend a woman in court was that, you know, this poor young thing was led astray by some man, so if you can pin it on a man, then she'll get off. And I kept telling Charlie that Erica Huggins was such a strong woman that no jury would ever understand what he said. Such a defense would just poo-poo it and pay no attention. And Charlie just couldn't understand how I could even be thinking of representing her. Maybe, you know, it was just, I mean, he was perfectly well-meaning. It was just that that wasn't how he did it. But Erica herself was one of the most beautiful exponents of feminism that I ever had the pleasure to represent. And although she had been involved to a certain degree in this horrendous thing, it was just, you had to bring out all of these various factors. Part of them, of course, is the relation of men and women in the black community, as well as, which is in itself a slightly separate thing, or maybe more, I don't know, yeah, it is separate and different. And so it was a sort of a 2-year process of my rethinking how you do things in court, and Erica educating me, I may say, not on just that, but on a lot of things. But I became a big advocate of doing certain things. Now, it began to show in various ways, you know, in the jury selection process, how you would examine women jurors. The standard textbooks up until that time on trial practice, and unfortunately I don't have them, because I'd love to. I would want to write about this, and I'm not sure how I'm ever going to find them. But there were these books that would say that there was a man named Henry Rothblatt in Brooklyn who did. You're not going to read it, don't bother. But he did a lot of trial work, and he wrote these books on how to try cases. And he would. One of his things was that you have to be worried about women witnesses. If you have them on the witness stand, if you're cross-examining, you be careful, because if they cry easily, and that will make the jury sympathetic to them. You should be sure to dress a certain way to impress a potential female jury. And all of these side things. But he too would have taken Charlie Gary's line about how do you defend a woman. You had to work through all these other details. Later on, I represented a woman named Susan Sachs in a rather notorious case down in Philadelphia. But when we were going through something called a pretrial conference, and we were having this conference, and the judge, I was there representing Susan. There was another woman with me, who's a local lawyer in Philadelphia, and her partner was a man. But all the prosecutors were all men, and the judge and the judge in federal court always has a bailiff who takes care of little details for him, like making sure the water jug is full. And it's usually some ancient political hack. That's unfair. I strike that one. Anyway, the judge decided he wanted to move counsel tables nearer the bench and just make it look less formal. So he pushes these two tables. He suggests that the tables be moved together. And this old man, and he literally was in his 70s, and not very, obviously not a healthy man, goes up and starts to move the tables, and all the men stood there and let him do it. And so I walked over and said, "Can I help you?" And so we're moving a table together. He was very thankful to me. And the judge said, "Miss Roraback, in my courtroom, ladies do not move the tables." And I said, if there were gentlemen in this courtroom, they would help an elderly man move the tables. I'll be happy if any of the gentlemen in this court will help this elderly man move the tables. At which point, of course, all the men went to work and rearranged the furniture. And then at the end of that session, when it was a question of when would we have this preliminary hearing, when would we do that, and I said, he said, "Are there any other requests?" The judge always asks, "Are there any other requests for the pretrial order?" And I said I had a couple of requests. And I would ask that at all times in the courtroom, my client be referred to as Ms. Sachs instead of by her maiden name, and that I be referred to as Ms. Roraback, because all of the prosecutors had been referring to me as Mrs., which is something that always gets on my nerves. I used to tell my family hated me for this. I always said, when someone would call me Mrs., I'd say my name is Miss Roraback. It's bad enough being one without being married to one. My brother didn't think that was fair. Anyway, I said, made this request, and he said, "Well, I'll enter the order so that it will be Ms. Sachs, but may I say Miss Roraback?" And I said, "Of course you are." The standard thing is they always refer to women as by their first name. You see. Mm-hmm. And they've been doing it to Susan all that time, so in the courtroom. Anyway, but it's things like that you can do, not get anybody angry about it, but just gradually raise the level of understanding. And then I always, as part of this, I have to tell the classic tale of Erica in the courtroom, because it was probably the most dramatic example of this that ever occurred. She testified in her own defense, and I don't know if you know the history of the Panther case, but what had happened was that she had come to New Haven from Los Angeles. She was married to John Huggins, who was from New Haven, and John was a Panther, and John had, actually I had represented him years before that, but anyway, John was in Los Angeles, was killed in a shootout with this other group, and So she came to New Haven with their then 6 or 8 week old child, a very small baby. And she was first came with his family, and then she, with some other people, formed a chapter of the Black Panthers in New Haven, and she moved into the Panther house. But she was there in the town with John's family, and needless to say, wanted to see their grandchild. And while she was in that Panther house, some Panther from New York came up with an individual whom he said had been an informer, and that they had brought him to New Haven, and then the local Panthers, he was slightly a wild man, but then they were, eventually what happened was that there was a trial, or a pseudo-trial, and they decided the Panthers decided he should be killed. Now, they didn't have testimony as showing who decided what. It was all being done on a conspiracy theory, actually, and several people were charged with the murder. Erica was charged as a conspirator, aider and abetter, etc., murder, kidnapping, etc. Bobby Seale had come to New Haven the weekend before this murder occurred and spoken at Yale, and he'd been in town for several days, and the murder occurred on something like Tuesday or Wednesday following that. There was no evidence anybody ever produced that he was at any point involved in deciding that this fellow should be killed, but he was killed, and they were all charged. And after a year and a half of proceedings, it came down to just a trial for Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins. So we get to the end of her testimony, and Arnold Markle is cross-examining her, and he has it all worked out for his final questions. You can just see this carefully planned thing when he began it. He said, if you were so upset about what was going on, why didn't you speak to someone? Why didn't you just call? You were out of the house all the time. You could have called the police. Why didn't you call the police? And it was a silly question for him to ask, because she could explain that, but she'd already put it in testimony that they'd actually arrested her for the murder of her husband out in Los Angeles, or on a conspiracy charge there too, because she wasn't at the scene where it happened. It was pretty easy to understand why she wouldn't necessarily trust the police. And she said something like that. And then he said, well, the Huggins family, you saw them every day. You could have spoken to them. And she explained to him that it's very difficult to talk to your in-laws about something like this. But, Arnold just kept right on. He said, well, Chairman Bobby was in town that weekend. Why didn't you speak to him? And she said, I did. He said, you did? Where was this? So she said, we were all having coffee at the house. And he said, what did you say? Oh, I guess she didn't say I did. She said I tried. And he said, where was this? And she said, where it was. And what did you say? And she said, I said, Chairman Bobby, there's a brother at the house. And he stopped. And she stopped. And he said, well, what else? What else did you say? And she said, well, he turned away. And he said, well, what else did you say? And she said, well, I said, I tried to start again, but he turned away. And he was talking to somebody else. And Arnold starts, what do you mean you tried? Why didn't you say that? She finally said, Mr. Markle, you have to understand that sometimes it's very hard for a woman to be heard by a man. And it was one of the most amazing moments of my life, I think, because we had 4 women on the jury. And I would be willing to bet that any one of them, every one of them, was ready to reach out and hug her. I mean, you could feel it. Every woman in that courtroom just, bingo. And Arnold, like the jerk he is, asked the question again. Sort of cemented it, And the only, Charlie Gary didn't get it. Bobby Seale turned to me. He was sitting next to me, and he said, isn't that just like me? He was the only one who had a human reaction to public. Anyway, we got hung jury. And we wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, it was just one of those moments of time. But, it's the sort of thing that only a woman could do, and actually the reporter for the Hartford Courant thought I'd planted it, which I wouldn't in a million years have had the brain power to do, but certainly we'd gone through the case enough, so, and Erica was such a good person in many, many ways that she really just did it, and it was a great moment in time. But that's the sort of thing that having women in the courtroom can do, and it certainly educated a lot of the men as well.
And another high-profile case that you prosecuted was the Griswold versus Connecticut.
Yes, defended. Yes, not prosecuted.
I'm sorry, defended. And
I guess it's prosecuted in terms of bringing the issues up.
You're absolutely right. How did you become involved in that case?
Now, this is long before I'd gotten into the more sophisticated elements of feminism in the courtroom. 1958, and this was, just a couple of years after the Smith Act trial, and also there were a whole bunch of other things going on during that period. It was the period of McCarthyism, and there were the House Committee on Un-American Activities came to New Haven, and we had hearings, and I was representing people at those hearings. I did some other defending people. There were a whole bunch of anti-communist absurdities, as I thought of them. They were very serious, but they questioned every member of the International Workers' Order in New Haven, having gotten their names from insurance records in New York State that had been made public. Things like that. Why did they have insurance? Anyway, I had a phone call from Fowler Harper one day, who had been a professor of mine at the law school, and who was a friend. And he said, and he taught, among other things, family law. He said, I've been involved in some conversations with Estelle Griswold and a man named, whom I didn't know at the time, Lee Buxton. Estelle had just come to New Haven as head of Planned Parenthood, as director of Planned Parenthood, and Lee was head of OBGYN at Yale. He said, "We're thinking of bringing a series of lawsuits," and he starts to explain what they're going to do to challenge the birth control statute. And we'll bring these suits to get a declaration from the court that the statute's unconstitutional. So we're going to, Lee would bring a case claiming that he has a right to practice medicine as he, according to his best lights and accepted standards, and that he should be able to provide contraceptive advice to patients and give them prescriptions in order to practice birth control. And then we'll have a woman who's a patient of Lee's, and I guess that case was going to, I'm not sure whether he talked about including this other case, but it was also in there when we did it. A woman who had had a stroke when she was pregnant and had to carry to full term because they couldn't operate, and she delivered I think it was a stillbirth, but she almost died in the process, and that if she ever became pregnant again, she'd die. Or if she became pregnant, I think that she would die, and or she couldn't carry the child to term at that time. There's a second case involved a couple that had an Rh blood factor. A third case that was a couple who had 3 malformed children, all of whom had been institutionalized and died early on in the institutionalized process, although they may have had one still at that point. And then there was a young couple of students at the law school who wanted to postpone pregnancy until after he finished his education. Engaged in family planning, in other words. And Fowler says, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in participating. So I said to him, are you asking me as a single woman or as a lawyer? And he had a great sense of humor, and he got into hysterics, and he said, oh, that's a great idea. And I said, well, I'm not doing it. And he said, okay. I said, but if you're asking me as a lawyer, I'd be happy to. So that's how I got involved. He had called me, actually, because he said I'd done all these tough cases, and I deserved a good one.
Okay, and how difficult was it to develop the arguments for Griswold? Well,
we went through that. We started those cases, which are known as declaratory judgment actions, and we got up to the Supreme Court. I mean, we lost in the Connecticut courts. There had been a prior case on, I don't know whether we should get into the history. There was a Nelson case in 1940 or something, 42, where the statute had been declared constitutional by the Connecticut Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in Connecticut, just citing that case, said that was the law, period. And then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it got tossed out. A case known as Poe v. Ullman, because as Frankfurter wrote in the opinion, he said the statute had never been enforced. Of course, he ignored the Nelson case in doing so, and he also ignored the argument. He just said it was the argument that there was always the threat of prosecution. But he just said it never had been enforced. And therefore there was no lawsuit properly before the court. decision was then made, and this is where I part company with some of the people who remember this part of history, but I think my memory is probably the best in terms of what actually happened. We decided to open a clinic. And I say we, sort of, Planned Parenthood decided to open a clinic. Estelle Griswold was the executive director of Planned Parenthood, and the board had been in back of this other litigation. I mean, I was hired by Planned Parenthood. Or I wasn't hired, but I was retained. It's a fancier word, to do that litigation. It wasn't, Fowler was doing the litigation in the Supreme Court, but he was not admitted in Connecticut, so we needed a Connecticut lawyer. And then, so Planned Parenthood decided, and I sat in on all of those conferences, but to open a clinic. Now, the general line that some people have taken is that was just done in order to get an arrest and be able to take a criminal case up to the court. Prove that the statute was enforced. I didn't take quite such a view of it. And I know that it was my advice that was being followed. But that the odds were, I wasn't positive actually that there would be a prosecution, but I thought the odds were that there might be. But in any event, we could open the clinic, and if there was no prosecution, then we'd just keep on going, and we'd open them up around the state. You see, there had been 6, I think, at the time of the Nelson decision, and they were all closed. So, but if there was an arrest, then we would take the case all the way, or as far as we had to go. So that's the beginning of that, when the clinic was opened. And it was opened in New Haven. It was open for 10 days. We spent a lot of time ahead of time planning things like what contraceptives would be available at the clinic. Lee Buxton was going to be the doctor, so handling it all, so that there wouldn't be he was going to take the rap, shall we say. And Estelle became sort of the executive of the clinic, so that she was the person who would be responsible for making decisions about it. Anyway, the clinic was open for 10 days, and there was an individual named James Morris who picketed the clinic. Have you seen any of that? Or
I have seen, some of it.
There is a picture of him picketing the clinic that was in the New Haven paper. But he also was not just picketing. He was telephoning everyone. It was a one-man crusade, really, quite interesting. It was not a big movement of people. Right? It was James Morris, and he called everyone. He called the governor. He called the senators. He called the chief state's attorney, and badgered the prosecutor in the then Circuit Court of New Haven. To get them to arrest these people and close the clinic down. And it was a one-voice operation. It was amazing. I had not expected, I'd expected it would be something different if it occurred, but this was just this one man doing it. In any event, he had stirred it up so much that the newspapers are asking the prosecutor every day, what is he doing, Somebody's asking the chief of police. The chief of police sends a detective over to the clinic, so Estelle shows him around, shows him the literature they're giving out and everything. Julie Moretz was the prosecutor in those days, and he was issuing a statement every few days, and he was investigating, he was considering, and so forth. And he didn't. And Morris was claiming that this was a big conspiracy between Yale and the prosecutor, because the prosecutor was a graduate of Yale Law School, as half the lawyers in New Haven are. But that this was, just a local town gown fight or something. He was the only person who was. Anyway, I went to see Julie Moretz because I said, look, Julie, I'm going to be representing them if you do arrest them. What's going on? And he said, well, I'm just going to have to do something. It's getting to the point where I have to do something. And I said, well, how would you do it? And he said, well, I'm not going to have, the patients aren't going to complain to me, so I'll have to have them go in and arrest Estelle and right there at the clinic. And he would have to seize records so that he could prove his case. And I knew this was, and in those days, they could do that sort of thing. It was, oh no, it was after that. But in any event, the law was pretty broad about what they could seize when they made an arrest. So he said that's what they were planning on. And I said, well, if I went through the records and got 3 clients who were willing to be your witnesses, would let me release their records to you, would testify, would that be? And he said yes. He would not raid the clinic. No. I may say Estelle was very angry with me because she was sort of a magnificent woman. she was rather frustrated, never having been arrested during the suffrage movement. So she was all set to get hauled off and taken down to jail. But I persuaded her it was better this way. And I got the permission of 3 women to release the records and gave them to Julia. And he started the prosecution. I brought Estelle and Lee down to headquarters where they surrendered. Yeah. And that was the beginning of the trial, and that, of course, went on. We tried the case, and they were found guilty by the judge. It went to the circuit court of, when there was a circuit court of appeals within Connecticut at the time. This is not the federal system, it's the state system. And we lost in that. That was the first appellate level. The second appellate level was the Connecticut Supreme Court, where we also lost, and then went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where we won.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how prominent was it at the time? Could you feel just how important?
Oh, it was tremendous. I mean, it was not exact. The day of the decision, I had a partner here in Canaan at the time. You always know when the case is going to get decided. It was the last day of the court, and they left it to the last day to decide. to issue the decision, and so we knew it would be that day we'd hear what happened. And we were all having lunch together at a restaurant and heard the decision, and needless to say had a celebration. Estelle was in her office. She celebrated there on the road. Lee Buxton was off in Europe. But it was, you know, it was a great day, and I called up Bill, said, you know, I thought I was going to quit the practice of law. It would never be this good again. And he said, that's fine, but just finish Mrs. So-and-so's will, and I did. And, which I did, and here I am still in the office.
Yes, you are. And what do you attribute to your longevity of your law career?
My longevity? It's a family trait. My father lived to 93, so.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you about some of the influential women that we often don't hear about, but have made some pretty special contributions in America's history.
Yeah.
And can you reflect on a few of them?
Actually, I don't know, when you say whom you don't hear about, then that's, but there are some people who've been forgotten, I think. There was a woman in Connecticut when I was going through all this incident. I'm talking about Griswold, Povey, Elman, Griswold. When I first got involved in that, I had a phone call one day in my office, and this voice said, "This is Alice Paul." And and I must say that I knew the name, but I had assumed she was dead. It belonged to sort of the history back in the suffrage period, and then immediately after that. Anyway, she was very much alive, or I don't know how old she must have been by that time. She must have been quite ancient. And so we talked, and she was calling because she was concerned that I might, she thought the Planned Parenthood people just didn't understand what was important in this world, that when we got the vote, women didn't win everything, and that you had to be organized politically, and that you needed a women's party, and that's, and she gave me the whole pitch, I may say, and sort of cross-examined me and made sure that I would not be led astray by these Planned Parenthood women. And I think she didn't understand the full power of Planned Parenthood, but that's neither here nor there. She just wanted to be sure that I didn't just get totally wrapped up in that and forget what was important in this world. And she used to call me every few months just to keep track of me until she died. And she was an absolutely wonderfully vibrant, inspiring person. So that's one. Certainly, I've always felt in any lawsuit I am involved in, that my clients are heroines. I mean, involved in for a woman. And Jane Doe, the woman who would have died if she had become pregnant, was to me one of the most wonderful people, in terms of her strength. And there was always the chance that her name would become public. I mean, we did keep it confidential until Mr. Garrow decided to dig it out, for which I've never forgiven him. But she was just a wonderfully strong woman, warm woman who wanted to do anything that would help in her own quiet way. And all of these women, such as the woman who became my friend, who was the plaintiff in that divorce lawsuit, they're all great people, and I happen to have been fortunate enough to have developed my career just at the moment when I could really do something with it. And one thing I didn't talk about before was that because I was such a prominent trial lawyer, and there were others in the country, I mean, I wasn't the only one, but certainly around this part of the world, I think that because I was doing cases that people read about, I mean, there were women who weren't quite so notorious as I was, but I became, I inspired, I know, and people have told me about it, a number of women to become lawyers and try cases, and that to me is, to the extent that I contributed to that, I think that's a wonderful thing. I had an occasion of, I guess it was QUELF, I'm not sure, Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund, if your machine doesn't know the acronym. I talked about how when women first began really appearing in court, beginning of the 70s, younger women, you'd see a young woman come in and sit down on her first case, and I was in court a good deal in those days, so I'd see this frequently. It was just so exciting for me, to see younger women who were actually there, and so I'd go over and introduce myself. I never knew what it meant to them. I just knew it was important for me, and welcome them. And it's, now you go to court and there's lots and lots of women in court, and it's just an entirely different scene. And it's to me one of the more exciting things that I probably helped.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you have any thoughts on our culture's focus on whether or not a woman can have it all, meaning career and family?
I think it's going to take a long time. A long time. I know, there are women who think they have it all now, but I must say that the conflict, unless you hire someone to take care of the family end of it, is just horrendous. And I'm not sure how they do it. I know I couldn't have, but maybe that's because it was at an earlier time. And there were people who managed it in those days too, but it is always with this terrible conflict and pressure, and that's not having it all. Having it all would be having it all with not with relaxation, but without this extreme pressure that distorts the joys of having it all. So you have to have that too, and I don't think that patriarchy has disappeared from our society sufficiently for that to have occurred yet.
Mm-hmm. And my final question for you, is there anything I have not asked you that you feel I should have asked? And if so, let me ask.
That's a toughie, because I talk about this so much that I'm never sure what I've talked about when I get finished. I was always, I suppose I'm trying to think back. When I was first in practice, I've told this story too. The first time I went to a county court short calendar. This is when I worked for Harry, and he had me doing it right from the start, you see. I walked into this courtroom, and short calendar is the day when all motions are heard, and if there are temporary little hearings up for a temporary injunction or something, the court calendars for the week is read so that people have to report as to whether they're going to be ready to try the case on the date specified. And if not, you have to get excused by the court, things like that. And in those days, almost all the bar went to every short calendar. I mean, this is in New Haven, in the county court. Well, you didn't, if you were a senior member of an office, you certainly didn't go take care of call the calendar. The junior went, so I went to this short calendar that first day in the fall of 1948. Because courts didn't meet in the summer in those days. A joy, I may say. But I went to this short calendar, and there was 100 lawyers or more in the courtroom, all talking to each other. They hadn't seen each other for the summer. Conversation level was way high. Everything from their golf game to their children to whatever. And I walked in, and of course they were all men, and it was dead silence. And I stood there, and no one said a word. And I was there until the judge came in and took the bench and called the court to order. And it was luckily not too long a period of time, but I was such an oddity. Various of them had heard of me. Actually, one or two came over and spoke to me at some point. But it wasn't ostracism. It was just. I mean, they were obviously curious to see how I do. I felt as though I was on approval, sort of, whether I could make it or not. But and that was sort of a sense of always being somewhat apart for all those early years. But a lot of the lawyers, a few of them, sort of took to me as, number one, I was a Roraback, so that was fine, but also that you almost had the feeling that some of them had daughters. They thought, well, maybe that type of thing. And of course, the ones who knew my family were all very gracious about being nice to me. So that it was fine, but I'll never forget that dead silence. Another thing that and I did a lot of cases, as you know, over the years. I did do an absolutely lovely case out in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska. There was a case. There was an Indian reservation, and in the state next to it. Anyway, I'm never getting. It was the Wounded Knee Reservation, anyway, whatever state. And this was in federal court. On Wounded Knee, there'd been a demonstration. This is when the things were going on all over, like the youth movement and the civil rights movements, and Wounded Knee, which occurred in the beginning of the 70s. The local Indian movement had, as they said, liberated the trading store on the reservation, and they had taken it over and just were giving out whatever was there instead of selling it to the Indians on the reservation. They would come on in, take what you want. And there, a number of arrests occurred that were prosecuted in federal court. And they were sort of overcome by need for lawyers. They had a committee to get lawyers together. So this woman who had known me and actually had worked for the Trial Lawyers Association and met me there was on this committee trying to organize lawyers for these defendants. And she called me and said, would I come out? You know, they were only getting men and there were some women defendants, and she would just like to have me come. And so I did. And, you know, you can get admitted on the pro hoc vice or whatever. They let you try a different jurisdiction on special motion. But the committee was arranging all this, having us as special public defenders since they didn't have enough lawyers to handle all this huge volume of cases. And I went out and I represented a woman who had driven to the trading post that day and to get gas because her son had broken his arm or had some injury, and she had to take him to the doctor, and she didn't have enough gas to get to the doctor, and who had been 18 miles away or something. So she goes to the trading post, and one of the leaders of this Indian movement comes out and he puts gas in her car, and she tried to pay him, and he said, no, we've liberated it. He said, don't you need anything? Or why don't you come in? You can get what you need. And so she goes in, and her son goes in with her, and her sister and her family had come along for the ride, you see, so all of them go in and take things. Now here's a kid who sees I think it was a fire truck, it was some sort of a truck. He gets this truck. She gets things like Pampers for the baby, salt, thyme I mentioned in some, THYME, some herbs, you know, the sort of stuff you might get when you go shopping. And they all get back in the car. By this time, they take it back to the house and decide to take the boy to the doctor the next day. Couldn't have been a very serious injury, I guess. Anyway, they go back to the house, and the marshals come following them in onto the reservation, into their house. The interesting thing about it, which I learned a lot about reservations in that time, was that where an Indian family lives, that's their property, and so the marshals can't just come on the property without a proper search warrant. So we had a good, you know, suppression motion going, and they certainly had to have some grounds for doing it. I think. In any event, when they went on the property, they go. I mean, obviously the car had driven back in before they came, and there are several different buildings on this thing. The common area where the family eats and lives and stuff, and then various side areas. So when they go into this house, and grandmother, the mother of my client, is there. She had the baby, and she was at this table with a pan of water, and she was washing the dishes, and the baby was there next to her, and they brought all this stuff in, and among other things there was some candy. And so when the marshals come marching in, having pulled the father out from under a truck where he was repairing it and marching him in, I don't know what he was getting arrested for, but then he pulling him. The baby had gotten upset, so the grandmother takes a piece of candy and sticks it in the baby's mouth. And so at the hearing to suppress this evidence, because they seized everything, the toy truck, this, that, I insisted that the marshals had to be there, and that I wanted them to produce everything they'd seized. And so, I'm putting into evidence a box of Pampers and a package of salt. And at some point, and putting a whole scene in, this is before a judge, the U.S. attorney is trying it, and for the government. And at some point, I finally got to the package of candy and had that marked as an exhibit. And then I said, was there any other candy that you seized? And he looked rather shamefaced, and he said, yes. And I said, do you have that? And he produces it. And the prosecutor had turned around, and he's looking at me with his back to the judge, and he just mouthed that. He said, not the baby's mouth. And I said, yes. But number one, I had all of the techniques of a trial lawyer, able to use it, and I had this wonderful time, and I don't think that a man could have pulled it off. I'm not sure they would have thought of it, frankly, because they probably wouldn't have talked to the mother as well as to the daughter before trying the suppression hearing. They just would have gone in and tried. But it was absolutely wonderful. Of course, the judge suppressed it, freed my client, and we went home. There's no trial. But the importance of having a woman there was very visible to me then.
Certainly seems that way.
And probably in some ways afterwards was one of the more meaningful things that ever happened in a lawsuit for me. I was staying in a hotel. I was flying out the next morning, and I got a phone call at the hotel from the office saying that the family and this young woman I represented were at the office and wanted to see me before I left. So I stopped there on my way to the airport, and there they were. Now they'd had to drive 600 miles to get to that court. And the brother was subpoenaed as a witness. She had a brother who was there at the house when this happened. He was subpoenaed as a witness. So he'd gotten a subpoena fee, and they used that money to pay for the gas. I mean, it's the way they got there was on his subpoena. And he had a witness fee too, I guess. And these people when we think of poverty, it's nothing compared to what they lived in. I just think they still do. Anyway, there was the family. The mother, you know, it looked like it was just a classic picture. The mother was there, the father, who was this man, not much taller than I am, but very stocky and looked like an Indian chief. You know, he had the face and the bone structure and everything. He was dressed in a suit and tie and so forth. And the brother was there, and the mother, and the little boy, and my client. And the little boy, the mother said that, and she was the only one who really spoke a lot of English. I guess the brother did too, but anyway, she said that she wanted to thank me for everything. And that they had gone to the store, and her son had picked out this present for me. So I accepted, and he gave it to me, very sweet, thanking me. And it was a little toy hutch, like that, tall with copper pots on it and stuff. It was really a very sweet thing. And then the brother thanked me, and he had bought a single stem rose. This is in November in Nebraska. I don't know what it cost him, but it was in a box. and they tried to take a picture. They had a Polaroid camera, but it didn't work, and they were very upset because they wanted a picture with me. And then the mother said that her husband wanted to say something, and he obviously spoke practically no English, but he had learned. And he said, thank you for giving us back our daughter. With this huge dignity, but it was really just, it was quite a day.
That is really special, and I so appreciate your sharing your story with us.
Yeah.
It is quite a story.
Yeah, no, it's really one of the
Thank you.
great moments of life. So, anyway, that's what being a lawyer is all about.
It is. Well, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. I always do cheer up on that, though.
I don't blame you.